Did you know that between 1895 and 1937, 93 men were executed behind the walls of Folsom Prison? But their stories, they weren't lost to time. They just needed a voice. Welcome to Falling Through the Trap, where we dive into the deep, often unsettling waters of historical true crime, as well as our criminal justice system, both past and present. I'm April Moore, author and criminal justice professional, and I invite you on a journey through the human stories buried in prison records, newspaper headlines, courtroom transcripts, and so much more. I'm not just recounting cases. I'm probing into justice's paradoxes and presenting humanity found in a place we're told there isn't any: prison. Through the stories of these 93 men, we'll look at history, ethics, and certainly the death penalty, and whether or not it should have a place in America's present and future. Hey everyone, thanks for being here. I'm releasing this bonus episode as a freebie, a little break from the usual fare of executions. I thought it pertinent to provide a little history of how California's penal system began. I started down this path based on a text given to me by the late Jim Brown, a former Folsom prison guard who ran the Folsom Prison Museum back in 2011 when I first met him. The 115-page text was written between 1976 and 1978 by Michael D. Brown, no relation, I believe, who at the time was incarcerated at a small prison in Susanville, California. He had spent much of his adult life in California prisons. And Paul Morse was Folsom's warden from the mid-70s to the early 80s and had known Michael Brown since 1951, when Morse was a correctional officer at San Quentin. In 1976, Morse basically commissioned a historical record of Folsom Prison, and he asked Michael Brown, who was transferred to Folsom, to do just that, because he wanted to commemorate 100 years of Folsom. In April of 1878, the legislature ordered that the prison begin construction, an act, by the way, that was approved 20 years earlier, 1858. The prison officially opened July 26, 1880. Michael was also known as Red, so Red Brown spent a couple of years compiling the history of the prison up until 1978, and according to a note in the back of the book, it was printed by the Folsom Vocational Graphic Arts students as a class project. Michael realized that to give readers a frame of reference, he had to discuss the history of San Quentin, the state's first prison that opened in 1854, which I'm glad he did because it's why Folsom was built. This took me down a longer path of discovery, and I got way more than I bargained for. And what I thought would be a short little bonus episode is going to be a two-parter, but I think you'll find it fascinating. California joined the Union in September of 1850 as a free state, meaning it would outlaw slavery. But the gold rush of the late 1840s had brought people from all over. A large portion of them were Southerners who saw a way to expand slavery, because what better place than one rich in agriculture and mining? Before it became a state, the population was just over 92,000. 10 years later, it had risen 310%. Shortly thereafter, a newly elected senator submitted a report about the state's criminal element, saying, California, as is well known, is infested by hordes of the most desperate scoundrels ever situated in one place on earth. They are accomplished in every art of villainy and are bonded together in a brotherhood of crime. Former convicts, outlaws, and desperados from all parts of the world have immigrated in vast numbers to this state, all attracted by the fable of our riches and the lust for plunder. Well, the senator wasn't wrong. Crime was bad. And while the state had county jails, they were in horrendous condition and housed everyone, men, women, children. So in the spring of 1851, the legislature approved the construction of the state's first prison. Keep in mind, there weren't too many prisons west of the Mississippi at this time, but the Jacksonian era, the first sort of wave in prison construction and management in America, favored rehabilitative labor as the main form of punishment. And so that would be the plan in California. The legislature handed over about 25 prisoners to two men, General Mariano Vallejo and James Madison Estill, who were expected to house, feed, clothe, and provide medical attention to the prisoners, who would in turn provide the labor. They'd build the prison. A few initial problems, however. The two men turned the prisoners over to a San Francisco sheriff while they scouted out locations. And according to Michael Brown, nearly all of the inmates escaped. General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo was also a California state senator in the state's first Senate, but before that was commander of the army post at Presidio and oversaw the secularization of the Mission San Francisco Solano under the Mexican Secularization Act of 1833, 12 years after Mexico gained its independence from Spain. Now, the act ordered the naturalization of all 36 missions in California to no longer be under the Spanish Catholic Church, but to Mexican authorities. Part of that act was to give the land, any livestock, and equipment from the missions to the native mission workers. Well, at first Vallejo did, then later transferred all of it to himself, about 44,000 acres in Petaluma Valley. 2 years later, he established the town of Sonoma. Now, none of the other generals followed through with the order to give portions of the land to the indigenous people. Not a surprise. Then we have General James Madison Estill, originally from Kentucky. He moved his family to Missouri, and there he farmed and even started a military prison. And he owned slaves. In addition to being a racist, he was a con artist, a charlatan, an opportunist at any cost. The cost to others, of course. Writer Kenneth Lamott said of Estill, he was a, quote, notable scoundrel whose mind was wild and injudicious, and his tongue was one of the foulest ever heard in a public hall. Estill came to California in 1849 along with 15 of his slaves, 14 men and 1 woman, whose surnames were Brown or Smith. He had real estate in Solano County valued at about $15,000. Today we're talking about well over $600,000. He wasted no time in weaseling his way into politics of this brand new state and was elected to the Senate in 1851 as a Democrat. And he had company because there were other Southerners who were pro-slavery Democrats in the Senate, and despite California being a free state, they set out to pass pro-slavery legislation. You see, the Federal Fugitive Slave Act that passed in September of 1850 stated that even free states were required to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves, but that was only if the slaves crossed state lines. Estill wanted to ensure that he and his Southern comrades who owned slaves in California would have recourse if their slaves escaped, so they drafted their own bill. This one gave enslavers a year to recapture a slave that they brought before California's statehood and take them back to a slave-holding state. The bill passed the Assembly in February of 1852, and there were many Democrats who opposed this bill, including Senator David Broderick. You'll hear more about him later, but in April, the bill, introduced by Estill, passed the Senate and was signed by Governor John Bigler. The law would get one-year extensions in 1853 and 54. It was not a surprise then that Estill was given the contract to own prisoners, most of whom during this time were minorities. Many historians consider Estill the founder of mass incarceration, or certainly the founder of privatized prisons. The state was still struggling to establish a capital, so part of this deal was that General Vallejo would donate about $135,000 to the state if they agreed to establish the seat of government in Solano County, where the prison would be built and where Vallejo owned tens of thousands of acres. Vallejo was supposed to build a Capitol building and the prison, but that didn't happen. So in 1853, the Capitol was moved to nearby Benicia, named after Vallejo's wife, and also a short-lived location for the Capitol. After the state decided to go with Sacramento as their seat of government, Vallejo asked to be released from the contract, and he was. But he did get the city of Vallejo named after him. He left Estill to figure it all out on his own. And as I said, Estill was an opportunist, and he saw one. Anchored in a bay near Vallejo, an abandoned ship, a two-masted brig, 13 years old, called, according to Brown, the Euphemia. But there were other sources that said it was called the Waban, but in 1854, another newspaper called it the Wabash, which was the name of a U.S. Navy ship, but not for a few more years. Anyway, Estill had this dilapidated vessel towed to Point San Quentin in the San Francisco Bay, and in December of 1851, several prisoners from surrounding jails were leased to Estill to begin work on the ship to make it a suitable prison while he looked for the perfect location for a permanent one. The prisoners also quarried stone on land leased by Estill that would be used to build the prison. But 7 months later, in July 1852, a site had not yet been officially determined, and the state stepped in. Estill continued to hold the lease on the prisoners, but now the Commissioner of Public Buildings and 3 prison inspectors were now in charge of finding a location, no more than 20 acres. Further, these inspectors would not only make the rules and regulations pertaining to the ship's prisoners, they would directly supervise Estill, which did not suit him, and he just did things as he wanted. The state ended up purchasing land adjacent to Point San Quentin for $10,000, and according to Brown, it was bought from, quote, unknown parties, but that Estill was suspected as the actual owner of the land. The state ordered the ship be beached and mandated that contractors submit bids to oversee the construction with the final approval made by the governor, yet no estimate on cost was given, and surprise, surprise, Estill was in business with the bidder who won, which also happened to be the lowest bidder. But Estill was not making a ton of money yet, one of the reasons he got into the private prison business. But as the leaseholder, he was responsible for feeding, lodging, and guarding the prisoners. He'd find a way, like selling black prisoners to slavery auctions in New Orleans. He'd find other ways to make money, not necessarily to uphold his end of the contract, but to fill his own pockets. And he did by bringing in silent partners who took an interest in his lease. These partners bought land, conveniently owned by Estill's father-in-law, next to the prison that became a brickyard that the prisoners worked, and he made money by selling those products. In 1854, he actually attempted to defraud the state treasurer. When confronted, he played dumb, pretending someone had forged his signature on a document requesting money, just before he received the money elsewhere. He figured if the state treasurer didn't know he got the money elsewhere, he might be able to double his money. Now, there wasn't enough to prove he did that, but as you'll get to know Estill, you'll have no doubt that's exactly what he did. At first, there were 40 to 50 male prisoners and 1 female prisoner, who, of course, did the laundry. She was confined to a cabin on the ship. But by January of 1854, a newspaper report said the prison hulk had 235 men housed in it, yet it was designed to really only accommodate 50. And according to Brown, conditions were far from pleasant. There was no ventilation, and obviously no sewer system. Even many guards refused to go near the place. That poor woman on the ship. Plus, there were escapes daily. Complicating things was that criminal laws were a mixed bag that seldom made sense. For example, larceny could earn you a life sentence, whereas arson got you 2 years. Everyone was being sent to Estill, and it was a circus. A reporter visited, and despite previous reports of horrendous conditions, this one read different. Quote, "The prisoners are for the time fed under a long shed, where a table is set out, supplied with for each man a large piece of good beef, a piece of fresh bread, larger than a New York 6-cent loaf, and in quality fully equal to the best baked in the city. Potatoes are also provided, and pea soup was likewise included in the bill of fare for the day. The prisoners ate heartily and cheerfully, and gave every indication that they were properly cared for." Interesting, considering all other reports were to the contrary, which makes me believe things were staged ahead of time, a very common arrangement, especially when it came to prison visits. The paper also noted that discipline was good under the constant watch of the 16 guards, but that, quote, "From present appearances, with the growing number of prisoners to be taken care of, there seems every probability that another structure, at least as large as that now being completed, will be immediately required, and if the money required is as judiciously expended as it has been under the present contract, the appropriation should not be delayed." The thing is, they didn't know Estill, or if they did, they were profiting in some way, because there was nothing judicious about Estill's spending. It took 2 years, but the first cell building, measuring 180 feet by 28 feet, called the Spanish Block, or the Stones, was 3 floors, and the first 2 were constructed with stone and the third of brick. The ground level had a long dormitory space that could hold 100 men. The top 2 floors were cells, 48 in total, each holding 4 men. This building actually lasted over 100 years before being demolished in the late 1950s. I couldn't find any record on what happened to the ship. But things didn't improve. In July 1854, due to horrendous and inhumane conditions in the stone quarry, a mass escape occurred where guards and several inmates were killed. A few months later, in October, Estill wrote a letter to the state trying to explain why so many prisoners under his charge had escaped that year, around 83. He wrote, "I feel that all the precautions that could be adopted could not prevent escapes from an open piece of ground without a wall or a safe cell in which to keep nearly 300 of the most enterprising and desperate set of men that have ever been congregated in any prison on earth." Estill claimed there really wasn't a prison at all. The editors of one newspaper pondered what in the world then had been done with the more than $153,000 that the state appropriated for the prison. We're talking roughly $6 million today. What has the state received for that amount? The editors asked. If the state prison is in so wretched condition that vigilant officers cannot prevent the escape of daring culprits, they continued, it is time the fact be known so that the people, through the legislature, may remedy the evil. A few more escaped in November, then a major mass escape in December. 60 attempted to escape and about 23 did, but it resulted in the deaths of several inmates and a few guards. Because there was no wall, prisoners could escape the grounds, most conveniently to the beaches, where boats owned by residents of the area were kept moored, and these became getaway boats. In February 1855, Estill submitted his report to the state, detailing the goings-on at the prison since 1851. He said when he entered the contract, he was under the impression he would have no more than 50 prisoners at a time, but now he had about 300, not including the 98 who he claimed had escaped over this period, costing him, he said, $12,000 of his own money to try to find them. And, quote, quite a number had been killed in attempts to suppress revolts. He also blamed the state's hodgepodge of criminal laws for the overcrowding, a fair point. He expressed regret regarding the new cell building itself. The ground-level large dorm could easily be breached, and a mass exodus could occur at any time. And without a wall around the prison, that was another thorn in everyone's side. Furthermore, the site lacked a guard's room or officer's quarters, no infirmary, or even a kitchen. The prisoners had to be marched 300 to 400 yards away for meals. Making things worse, another thing Estill didn't foresee was the dense fog that rolled in and settled over the site quite often. It not only provided the perfect cover for escapees, but the moisture affected guards' guns, dampening the powder and rendering them useless. Estill said the fog had, on one occasion, forced him to keep the men confined for a week, unable to leave for meals or to work. He also learned the downside of using prisoners as laborers. The very tools they used to build their confines were used to prevent their confinement, like using them as weapons. None of this he took any responsibility for, by the way. The entire endeavor from the very beginning was so ill-conceived and proved Estill's ineptitude that this elected senator was really a con man. Michael Brown wrote that an investigation was conducted and the ensuing report was a, quote, well-written document discussing penology in a spirit of broad humanity. Unfortunately, he wrote, it had little effect since the testimony gathered appeared tainted with bias from discharged guards and employees, convicts, and other disgruntled parties. There were, however, 6 conclusions from that report. 1. That there were saloons on the premises that prisoners had access to, one on the ship and another in the cookhouse. 2. That the guards were alcoholics and responsible for some pretty serious breaches of conduct. 3. That the trustee system, inmates given more leeway and higher level duties, had completely deteriorated. They had been given permission to basically roam free and were sent on errands to San Francisco, alone. 4. The food situation was abysmal. Quality and preparation were extremely subpar, and because of Estill's financial disarray, deliveries were inconsistent. 5. The private management was a disaster, and that conditions due to no wall and insufficient cell space were inhumane and unacceptable. And 6. The prison and its short history, rife with escapes, had been detrimental to property values in Marin County, as well as the crime rate in the area. And one other note, there were 3 women at the prison during this time. Scotch Mary, Dolores, and Russian Kate. Brown wrote, all 3 were charmers of the first order, according to the stories circulated, and had the guards and convicts at each other's throats for their favors. But while they apparently showed no favoritism between guards and prisoners, they could always be trusted to not say who was responsible for the frequent pregnancies. A matron was eventually hired to keep the co-eds from mingling. So the report wasn't glowing, and Estill agreed to sell his contract back to the state. for $100,000. And his brickyard and stone business would also be sold. This proposed buyout confused a lot of people. A Nevada City paper asked, but why buy him out of a contract that he fails to execute and may not be made to relinquish, but may be prosecuted for heavy damages for not fulfilling? Some of these damages the paper referred to were crimes committed by the escapees, including rape and murder. Well, Governor John Bigler refused to approve giving Estill anything, and unless some deal was done secretly, which some suspected, Estill walked away with nothing, which wasn't his style. But he also walked away without being held accountable for anything, which might have just been the deal. In 1855, the state approved a 3-person prison board, later be increased to 5, who controlled the prison. They would be paid $3,500 a year, but one condition was that they had to live at the prison. They were authorized to hire a warden, but the warden could choose his own staff. And he could also withhold wages or even imprison guards up to 30 days if they quit without notice, if he could find them. The board took over buying supplies and were tasked with overseeing the construction of a wall around the prison, as well as other necessary buildings. They also devised rules and regulations concerning discipline and labor. Their first order of business was to hire more guards and cover the back wages that Estill had fallen behind on. Things got better, morale improved, and escapes decreased. In November, construction of the walls was finally completed. They commissioned 500 feet of wall on each side, but for some unexplained blunder, one wall measured 593 feet, giving the prison an asymmetrical appearance. And blunder would really become the theme of San Quentin's origin story. Other things didn't quite go right. While the state provided materials and labor, contractor fees were about $125,000. But then exact details were made public, and it was found that the board spent nearly $500,000 in its first 11 months. An exorbitant amount then, around $20 million today, and there was very little to show for it. Governor Bigler fired the entire board. Taxpayers were furious, and so the prison budget was drastically cut, and the new board was instructed to be as economical as possible, extremely typical when it comes to prison funding. The state was appalled by the abhorrent conditions made by the stingy Estill, but now that they were footing the bill, they had no problem cutting corners, which just fed the problems they were trying to fix. And this would become apparent in 1856 when the new board issued their report. In addition to needing another cell building, they noted there wasn't enough money for food, clothing, or medical supplies for the 480 people that included prisoners, guards, and other employees. The board wrote, "Common decency and humanity require that some provision be made by the state for the proper care of those who have been imprisoned for violation of her laws. The directors do not deem it reputable or humane for the state to punish felons by starvation or by withholding such articles of clothing at will, at least hide their nakedness, and give them some protection against the inclement seas of the seasons." The board asked for $15,000 a month and food ASAP. Within a week, the state passed an emergency bill, and the new governor, J. Neely Johnson, provided the money. I have to pause just for a second and explain that the first 2 governors of California were nonpartisan. Bigler, who took office in January of 1852, was a Democrat. He lost his re-election to Neely, a member of the American Party, a political movement by old stock nativists, descendants of the original settlers of the 13 colonies, called themselves, offensively, the Native American Party. It wasn't long at all before they were referred to as the Know-Nothings or the Know-Nothing Party, because when asked about their inner workings, their response seemed to always be, "I know nothing." This pro-slavery, xenophobic party, said to be largely run by weak, inexperienced, and ignorant leaders, didn't last that long, just a few years, and voter backlash in California would usher in a Republican Party, but not for several more years. And this report by the new prison board also floated the idea that another prison was going to be needed, and it would be all about location, because it had become apparent how inconveniently located San Quentin was. Transportation of prisoners to San Quentin was costing thousands of dollars. Alexander Bell, a state prison board member, wrote, "The fact has always been apparent that the state prison was located in a ridiculous position, and we never could perceive a sensible reason why the commissioners should have located it unless they were personally interested." Well, this would support the rumor that James Estill owned the land at the time. The commissioners were likely in his pocket. But right now, what to do about the prison? One paper wrote, "The cheapest plan to the convicts is acknowledged to be that of farming them out. From appearances, General Estill is about the only man who would take the responsibility, and it is quietly rumored that the State Prison Committee are favorably disposed to give him the contract to take charge of the convicts, but the payment of a stipulated sum annually or per month by state." Surely that's crazy, after everything that man did and didn't do to the state's treasury detriment. Another paper chimed in saying, "Such a measure is scarcely better than making the state boundaries the limit of the prison grounds and bidding every inhabitant defend himself as best he can from the desperadoes who are turned loose within such limits. The people will never endorse such a plan." Right. It's nuts. They wouldn't do that. They did just that. They gave Estill a 5-year contract, paying him $10,000 a month, over $400,000 today. One paper wrote, "Was ever such recklessness exhibited before the legislative and executive authority of a state? Was there ever a greater swindle practiced upon the people of California? Of course General Estill has the contract. Did not General Estill give Neely Johnson the nomination of governor? Was there ever a more outrageous or damnable contract?" It was bizarre, because while it supposedly came with strict standards in regard to meeting prisoners' basic needs, and that guard and employee salaries had to come out of that $10,000 a month, Estill had discretion over prison labor and could keep profits to himself. It wasn't revealed until days later that other contract bidders were willing to take less, but Estill ended up with it because he did such a bang-up job the first time. "It was a most notorious fact," read the Placer Herald, "that the convention which nominated the present state officers was controlled by General Estill, and was generally believed that the nominees would be compelled to obey his wishes. It was at the time predicted and asserted, and now we have the verification in the result." He had money, and therefore the power, and was a performer, so he knew how to get back in. Not only did he switch political parties from Democrat to the American Party while campaigning for Johnson, he divulged secrets of the Democratic Party to the press under an assumed name. It was shown that the original amount to a lessee was going to be $15,000 a month as needed, resulting in $900,000 over 5 years from the state, but the commissioners feared the indignation of the taxpayers, and so, as one paper put it, hinted to the unpretending general that he must be contented with a little less, which, patriot that he is, he most graciously consented to do so. What a guy. And the Know-Nothing Party was living up to its name. what's the first thing Estill does? He reduced guard salaries, and many of them quit. The prison management, overseen by an equally incompetent, overpaid prison board, was considered a joke for the next 2 years. The prison was called an odious eyesore, and that, quote, instead of a place of punishment, it is made a retreat for quiet banishment. One story came out from a man named Bill White, who had escaped from the prison with a few others in May of 1855. He was recaptured in October 1856, and he said his escape had actually been orchestrated by the guards under orders of Estill. The guards even shot blanks at the men escaping. White told the papers that everyone knew Estill didn't want to be in his contract anymore, but couldn't get out of it. My opinion always has been, White said, that he adopted this course to make the contract seem odious to the people so he could be relieved of a bad bargain. Estill was a schemer, always looking for a way in or a way out. Given the number of escapees under his watch and the fact that he didn't appear to fight for the original buyout, it's certainly plausible. It fit his personality, but we can't know for sure. He never even made a statement that I could find. So now he was back to being a Democrat. More proof Estill was loyal to no one, only temporarily, to those who could advance him. And now his name was being thrown around for Speaker of the Assembly, having been elected a seat for Marin County in fall of 1856. The following January, the Sacramento Age newspaper wrote, perhaps no one connected with the present legislature is so painfully situated as General J.M. Estill. He has a combination of diseases, and we pity him. This is the diagnosis of his ailing. He is lessee of the penitentiary, foul stomach, representative for Marin, slight weakness, candidate for speaker, intermittent fever. His seat in the Senate is to be contested, nervous excitement. His property has been attached to debt, bowel complaint. It is hardly possible for him to survive. Well, that's the thing about cockroaches. They always seem to make it through. His seat was being contested because he didn't actually reside in Marin County. The Sacramento Age wrote, he impudently goes into the House without being able to substantiate his right to a seat, engages deeply in the senatorial scheme, and inaugurates himself chief brawler on every issue presented. But that which goes furthest in making him a political monstrosity is his management of a state institution established for the protection of society against the influence and acts of vile persons. He is lessee of the state prison, and under his control it has reached a condition of rottenness unequaled by any similar concern in the Union. The accusations were that prisoners lived more as if they were at a resort, that they were permitted to visit San Francisco or ranches in the area. They could go fishing, hunting, and on all sorts of solo excursions. Others have escaped, and no effort had been made to recapture them, and that Estill had become friends with most of them. He is one of those who are always knocking at the door of the Treasury, said the paper, one of the rats that gnaw great holes into the public money vault and purloin state valuables. He is first among the ones who should be hurled from office and contemptuously kicked down to the dark, filthy alleys that lead to their own appropriate habitations. Meanwhile, despite the wall around the prison, inmates continue to escape, mostly because Estill allows them to work outside the prison walls, on farms and on building roads that he promised his constituents. It was also known that prisoners could buy their freedom from Estill. One newspaper confirmed 52 escapes in the 9 months that Estill had regained control of the prison, but suspected the number to be closer to 100. What's more was that Estill was appointing inmates to positions within the prison such as prison clerk, superintendent of buildings, assistant captain of the guard, and the commissary. This from a politician running on the law and order tickets. The public had grown so sick of Estill, calling him the biggest felon in the prison and a, quote, political insect. The press kept asking why his seat in the House was not being investigated amid accusations of election fraud on his part, but it was found that the judge of elections was a friend of his. Estill's home, where his wife and I believe 6 children lived, was in San Francisco, and he could never prove he had a home in Marin County, other than a bed he occasionally slept in at the prison. But there was so much quid pro quo happening that I couldn't even keep up. The papers called it senatorial bargain and sale, and Estill was always in the middle of it all. Even with no proof of his residency, the Committee on Elections approved Estill's seat in the Senate. He used his newly purchased position to publicly scorn the press, calling the institution a disgrace to any civilized community. He said it was perhaps more licentious than any other press in the world. He said no one is more patriotic than him. He'd berate and disparage anyone who dared to criticize him. His tirades were described as uncouth, petty, unfit to print, and what was even more infuriating was that his fellow lawmakers would allow him to do it. He spent 2.5 uninterrupted hours on the assembly floor as official legislative business, berating a particular newspaper editor and his dead brother. He also attacked private citizens. Not only were foul-mouthed tales told of private individuals, one disgusted newspaper editor wrote, with whom the assembly had nothing to do, but the most cowardly scandals about ladies were retailed to the gaping crowd, which, whether true or not, no man would ever repeat unless in strictest confidence. Another paper read, "It sure be a source of humiliation when General Estill is the mouthpiece of a great party and advocates law and order. The House disgraced itself by allowing General Estill's long-winded tirade of assertions, surmises, and innuendos couched in low language and abounding in still lower ideas to be read." Yet another wrote that the notorious General Estill was, quote, one of the most shrewd and unscrupulous of all the unscrupulous horde of politicians who have fattened upon the state, the hero of the state prison swindles, and a prominent actor in nearly all the thieving operations that have brought disgrace and embarrassment upon the government. Meanwhile, back at the prison, conditions were said to be vile. The rotten and spoiled food fed to the prisoners had resulted in sicknesses and even a few deaths. Their clothing was also inadequate. You wouldn't think it could get worse, but it did, as it was revealed that a member or two of the State Prison Committee, appointed to oversee the management of the prison, were part owners of Estill's prison contract, which meant promised investigations never occurred and reports were falsified and in Estill's favor. But when he kept asking for more money, the Senate refused to permit it, and in February of 1857, the new State Prison Committee recommended the annulling of the contract and that an entirely different system be devised to conduct the prison. The prison was in shambles, and the escapee count since he took over was now about 70. There are men who, while they are known to be unprincipled, read one paper, have yet some touch of human feeling within their bosoms to redeem them. But here is a being so soulless, so barren of every sentiment that belongs to our common humanity, that he coldly speculates upon human misery, coins money from the tears of starving wretches who have no protector but him, and, for the sake of saving the expense of relieving him, turns a deaf ear to the appeals of those who are already shut out from the world that scorns them and dare not raise their despairing eyes to the cold, unanswering heavens above. A man who could thus take advantage of miserable creatures like these, vile as they are, simply because they are in his power, is so far beneath them in every attribute of a man that we know of no terms of baseness adequate to describe him. Ouch! Estill felt that one and blamed the Attorney General and members of legislature for injuring his credit, so he couldn't procure food for the prisoners, which meant he was purchasing food on credit, not the $10,000 he received each month that was allocated for food. In March of 1857, a year after he took control again, the Committee of the Assembly on State Prison Affairs issued their report after an investigation. As expected, it wasn't pretty. The cell building was completely inadequate to accommodate the prison population. There were several buildings outside the prison on land not owned by the state being used, like for a bakery, offices, storehouses, and dining areas. The prisoners didn't have enough clothing. Many were without shoes. None had socks. And they were filthy, only wearing the same clothing they did have day after day. When Estill had taken over, the state had provided funds for clothing. But by November, when a committee member had visited the prison, he found not only most were without shoes and enough clothing, the food was deemed inedible. So, these 6 months later, nothing had changed. The food, specifically the meat, was found to be in states of decay. 6 prisoners were even unaccounted for, and Estill himself was nowhere to be found. The trustee system, or as the committee referred to it as favoritism, was deemed criminal, that Estill was essentially guilty of aiding and abetting prisoners to escape, since trustees were allowed to come and go as they pleased. Therefore, Estill's contract should be voided, since it was stated he was to keep prisoners in the prison. The committee also found that the prison commissioners who entered into the contract with Estill deserved censure, since no rules or regulations were set forth. And further, the Board of Prison Directors, who should have been overseeing the management, were completely useless. The report put forth a long list of recommendations that included getting rid of Estill and hiring an independent manager with prison experience, to build another cell building with separate quarters for men and women, build a hospital, abolish the trustee system, provide more clothing, and increase the quality and quantity of food. How did Estill respond? How you'd expect. Acted injured and innocent. Denounced the evidence, saying that it was malicious and unjust, that he didn't have a fair chance to show his own side since he wasn't there during the investigation. And because he was a skilled, sly charlatan, he put on a real dramatic show of righteousness. The Sacramento Bee wrote, "Were we a friend of General Estill, which we are proud to say we are not, we would advise him to compromise this matter with the Select Committee as speedily as possible, deliver the whole business of the state prison into the hands of the state, pack up his duds, and leave the country, for the very people hiss at his back as he passes through the streets." Estill declared he'd be willing to give up the contract and make the best of it, since he's just one guy against everyone else. But for a price, $100,000. They did give him $5,000 to immediately go toward meeting the basic needs of prisoners. When the state offered him $50,000, he said $90,000. The House couldn't agree on what to do about it. Pay him, remove him, and let him sue. No one could understand why he wasn't being forcibly removed, because he was clearly grossly negligent. It would have been easy to prove he was in breach of contract. Public opinion was that someone with experience be brought in. No more of the lowest bidder contract stuff. And whatever the state had to pay to get Estill out of their hair would be worth every penny. So, finally, at the end of April 1857, they agreed to $90,000 and submitted a bill to grant a John Macaulay the contract for $5,000 a month. Not exactly following the committee's recommendations of abolishing the contract system. And who was John Macaulay? Turns out, just another capitalist who would later be described as, quote, never being distinguished for scruples of conscience. He was enabled, at the expense of much human suffering, to make a great deal of money. There was a rumor that Estill would have an interest in Macaulay's lease, but Macaulay said he'd be willing to have a clause inserted into the bill specifically prohibiting Estill from profiting. Great, super. But then the bill wasn't taken up. No one could agree on what Estill deserved, and so nothing was done. But Estill was no dummy. He thought, well, if the state wants Macaulay, then okay, I'll bring them Macaulay. And Estill transferred half his lease to Macaulay, and so no matter what happened, even if the state got Estill out, he would continue to profit until 1861 when the contract was up. And Macaulay, he was just Estill 2.0. Important to note here, the state could have gotten rid of Estill and taken control of the prison, but they didn't because $90,000. They would regret that decision and so many others so hard. It was business as usual for the next several months, including mass escapes from the prison. January of 1858, visiting officials called the prison in inhumane and semi-barbaric conditions. Prisoners still didn't have adequate clothing. There was a lack of medical attention and supplies. Cells were overcrowded and vermin infested, and just terrible food, which there wasn't even enough of. Prisoners were still being allowed outside the prison walls to work on farms, to make the bricks, and to run errands. And Estill hadn't followed through with constructing additional buildings as ordered. And again, the State Prison Committee complained of the location. Expensive to get to and located near water, where the boats were docked and made escapes even easier. Plus, the area lacked resources. The clay for making bricks was virtually exhausted, and the quarry was nothing more than a big boulder. The committee felt the state needed to take action immediately. This prompted a resolution passed by both houses forbidding the state controller to pay Estill another dime, even though his contract didn't expire until March 26 of 1861. This decision, or rather blunder, would come back and bite the state in the ass, as would their next move. In March, the legislature passed a temporary act permitting new governor John Weller to take immediate possession of the prison, and he and his officers, including the lieutenant governor, Walkup, demanded entry, busted down some doors, and took the keys from Macaulay and ordered him out. For the next year or so, things ran relatively smooth, and the state found that the cost of maintaining the prisoners was less than $5,000 a month, and there was a fraction of the number of escapes, and things got done. This was also when the legislature approved an act to begin the search for a site for a new prison, although the area of Folsom was already being touted as the perfect spot. But Macaulay and Estill weren't done. They filed suit against Governor Weller in December of 1858 for damages resulting from the breaking and entering, and it was actually the state Supreme Court that heard the case. And at the end of March 1859, they ruled in favor of Macaulay and Estill. The court ruled that the governor had no right to forcibly take possession of the prison, that the legislature had no power to authorize their officers to take possession of anything like that. And they weren't wrong. The legislature made themselves the judge and jury when this contract dispute should have gone to the courts. and that this applied to everyone. No one, not even the government, was above the law. They acknowledged that, yeah, prison management under the state had been very good, economical, fewer escapes, but that didn't negate the governor's actions. This was a job for the Attorney General, who, weirdly, took zero responsibility for not advising the governor on the law. This was a big oopsie-doops, and something you would have thought could have been avoided by the state's Attorney General, but he seemed to be pretty quiet on the whole matter. So what did this mean? It meant the state paying about $25,000 and reinstating Macaulay as the prison leaseholder. Then part of the state's problem went away. On April 26, 1859, James Estill died. He was 48. Some sources said it was his liver, another said heart disease, and yet another said congestion of the bowels. There was no love lost between Estill and the public, the press, or the state. One paper wrote, "He bore the reputation of being a faithful and warm-hearted friend, but an unscrupulous politician, and is said to have allowed nothing to stand in his way of success. His connection with the public affairs of California was neither honorable to himself nor beneficial to the state." The Sacramento Bee wrote, "No man has received 1/10 the money from the state that General Estill did, and no man made greater profit on what he received." He was called a modern Midas, for almost everything he touched turned, under his magic hand, into gold. His death didn't really do anything except remove a very obnoxious man. Macaulay was still a force to be reckoned with. He was reinstated as head of San Quentin on May 12th, and less than 2 weeks later, 14 prisoners escaped. Now, under state control, the prison had about 20 escapes. That might sound like a lot, but compare that to this. Going back to March 1st of 1854 to June 1855, under Estill, 114 had escaped. And then from June 55 to March 56, when the state had short control, 15 had escaped. Then, after the state made their ill-fated decision to bring Estill back, and eventually Macaulay in March 56 to March 58, 156 prisoners escaped. So, once again, it was business as usual, because in July, 42 escaped, 10 were killed. This occurred about the time the governor, Secretary of State, the treasurer, and the controller went to the prison to reason with Macaulay and try to get him to relinquish his lease, and he refused. A week or so later, still in July, another several prisoners escaped. In all, about 80 since Macaulay took over, and he also brought in another investor, a man named Lloyd Tevis. The state filed suit asking the court to appoint a receiver, someone to take possession of the prison. But in September, the judge denied the motion, saying it didn't settle the issue of the contract. The state kept wanting a judge to say, yes, the prison is yours, take it. But what the court was saying is that the contract needed to be looked at. It got a little confusing. Somewhere in these next few months, the state appealed the case and it was going back to the state Supreme Court. Oh, and more escapes in October. January 1860, a new governor, Milton Latham, and he declared this leasing of prisoners business was done. And we're going to get this Macaulay idiot out. It's draining the treasury. The public was losing it, especially those who lived in Marin County. Not only did their property values plummet, but they were living in terror because escaped criminals were all around them, and they were victims of crime committed by them. The state made it their mission to regain possession of the prison, and Macaulay said, okay, how about for $275,000? He was being generous, he said. knocking off about $75,000 of what he felt he was owed. And keep in mind, the state hadn't been paying Macaulay. They quit paying him a long time ago. You know, that decision that would bite them in the ass later? Well, later came, and it was the state Supreme Court that chomped down. It ruled against the state's claim that the contract was illegally drawn. It wasn't. Or that the state could even rescind on the contract because of breaches committed by Estill and Macaulay, because the state itself was in default by withholding those funds to begin with. When the state first discovered that Estill wasn't following through with his end of the bargain, the state should have filed suit right then and there. That would have been the proper and only course of action available to them, but they didn't. Just like with the case against the governor, the court said you can't act as judge and jury, especially when you yourself violated the contract's terms. And again, the court acknowledged wrongs were being carried out by Estill and Macaulay, but the state was wrong when they withheld funds. It was a very big, costly letdown for the entire state. The Nevada Journal of Nevada City, California wrote, "Blunder had followed blunder, as if blunder was the design of all engaged in the business of regulating the prison, and everyone on coming to power was obliged to tread in the footsteps of his predecessor." And this was one pricey blunder, nearly $300,000. Millions were poured into this entire fiasco, and for practically nothing. So one more year of Macaulay? Hell no, said the state, especially after 19 more prisoners escaped. Finally, in August 1860, Macaulay and Tevis negotiated and settled for $275,000, a good portion going to Estill's estate, but they would still be in charge of prison labor contracts for 2 more months since they had obligations with businesses. The prison was placed under the new lieutenant governor, and that was the beginning of San Quentin being state-owned, but also the continued and frankly ramped up contracted prison labor to private businesses. This went on for about 20 more years. Prisoners worked for free until it was seen as conflicting to work for private businesses, so then the labor was for state purposes only, still unpaid. And the business of making jute bags for local farmers began, the prison's moneymaker for over 60 years, until the mill burned down in 1951. It really wasn't until May of 1861, a month after the Civil War began, that the state was officially rid of Macaulay. After months of nitpicking prices, there were allegations of bribery and corruption against some senators, against Macaulay. It went back and forth, but finally in May, they were rid of him, and out of money, which meant the new prison wasn't going to happen for a bit. It wasn't until 1878 that construction began on Folsom, 20 years after the legislature approved the new prison. That story, part 2, is available on Patreon. So, did they learn from the fiasco that was San Quentin? Or did 20 years erase the memories of that? Yes and no. And that senator, David Broderick, who opposed Estill's pro-slavery bill, he was killed in a duel with David Terry, who had just before that resigned from the state Supreme Court, same one who handed down decisions in the Macaulay case. Terry was pro-slavery, and it was said that Broderick, before he died, said this duel was sparked by his anti-slavery stance. Well, thanks for joining me for this little bonus episode, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you'll head to the Patreon to listen to part 2 and hear about how Folsom Prison became Folsom Prison. Falling Through the Trap is written and produced by me, April Moore. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and follow the show on Instagram at Falling Through the Trap. I'll post photos and other documents on the show page, apriljmoore.substack.com, where you'll also find links to YouTube and to Patreon, where I provide bonus material, including bonus episodes. I'll release 1 to 2 new episodes each month, always on Fridays, where you'll learn the story of the next man to fall through the trap at Folsom Prison.